You know, the COVID restrictions may be lifted on everything, including travel, but the COVID persecutions are continuing, and that means we're still fighting those lockdown and quarantine tickets in court. But I've got a victory to tell you about today. You know, so many people who tried to do everything right were still caught up in the COVID lockdown ticketing madness. And the quarantine tickets were especially bad because they were so expensive and punishing. If you were a Canadian family trying to navigate the ever-changing rules at the airport, sometimes your whole family got slapped with quarantine tickets. $5,000 a pop, a family of five, 25 grand just for trying to come home. Today I've got a crazy story to tell you about, but it's got a great ending. Thanks to all of you who donated to fightthefines.com and to the Democracy Fund, where you'll get a charitable tax credit for your donations in the fight for civil liberties. Kevin Cormack is a proud Canadian. He's an unashamed Canadian. You'll get that when you listen to him talk. He's got a Philippine-born wife who's also a Canadian citizen, and when they tried to come home from the Philippines, where they had been living for part of the year, they had a plan to quarantine, a plan to follow the rules. They had complied with testing. They even quarantined in the Philippines before they came to Canada, and yet they still ended up with the pile of these quarantine tickets. But thanks to your donations to fightthefines.com through the Democracy Fund, we have had those tickets tossed out. So let's hear from Kevin about the victory against COVID tyranny, thanks to you at home. So it's clear to me that you love Canada, really proud of Canada, but you left. Why did you leave?
It's a great question. I get answered a lot, and I've even had family members question what we're doing without asking us why. I'm proud to be Canadian. I used to brag to my wife when we first met how amazing, our Charter of Rights was. I remember bragging to her over and over. That was something that we had as Canadians, which was why I wanted her to be a Canadian citizen. We left because we felt that had been changed. And actually, that's one of the reasons we're calling is last year we came back here for business. We try to keep the kids rooted in both countries. Our dream was to spend 3 months in the Philippines and 9 months in Canada running a business that we established in Canada that was partnered here in the Philippines, distributing grain for the farmers here in the Philippines. And so we got here in March 2021. And then we only could stay for 2 months because we had to get back to our farm for planting in Canada for May. So we helped the neighbor seeding. That's one of the reasons that I make money is I'm an agronomist, and I helped a lot of the local farmers and make money through the summer. We flew back from the Philippines after an amazing 2 months here. We had been completely bubbled. We had protected ourselves and our family. But when we were given the Arrive Can app upon the last minute trying to re-enter our own country, I read through it. I filled it all out as best as I could, and there was a clause in it at the time that they removed later, by the way, that said that you were allowed to either go for the 3-day quarantine that they assigned in the hotels, or you could present your own quarantine plan. So when we arrived at the airport, we attempted to present this to the border security, which was what the Arrive Canada app said you could do. And they told us they didn't want to see it. They didn't want to hear it. They just said, if you don't have a QR code for the hotel, you have to go to that health office over there, which was a provincial health office, which was puzzling because we were entering the country internationally. And we were going to travel to another province. So I was puzzled why it was a BC health office mandating a rule by the federal government that we had to go to a hotel to quarantine. I asked if they could explain the hotels, because that was the problem I was having the last week when we left. Like, is the hotel like it was in the Philippines, fully quarantined hotel, or was it a split quarantined hotel? In other words, having public in there. And They were unable to answer the question, but my research had showed me that they were all split quarantine.
Yep.
They told me I had to take a public taxi cab to that quarantine hotel. And I said, I'm not willing to put my family at that risk, let alone the people in BC. My mom lives in BC. She lives in Kamloops. I don't want to put the senior people and the stuff who were higher at risk at the time. I had a better quarantine plan, I thought, that I was allowed to present. Now, it took us about an hour and a half, and they said, "Are you refusing to have the swab test there?" And I said, "No, like we've already tested negative, and I'll go test before we leave the airport, but I'm going straight to my truck and I'm going to go home and quarantine for 14 days." So they came back again and said they were threatening to take us by force for 14 days federal quarantine. And then the girl slipped, I think, by accident, says, "If you don't take that now, we're going to have to give you $3,500 fines each." And I said, "Okay, please just give me those fines, please." And then she couldn't go back and she didn't know what to do. So she went back to her manager again and then had to send another 20-ish-year-old boy who had to write the tickets, and he had to write them individually to my wife and me. And I wasn't even allowed to sit and see the instructions he was giving my wife while he was writing these fine tickets. We took the tickets, we took our luggage, we went and did our swab tests there in the airport, following the ArriveCAN app steps, and we couldn't submit our alternative quarantine plan. But then we drove home, got to Saskatchewan 2 days later, locked ourselves down, made the phone calls every day like we were supposed to. We ended up swabbing on day 8. If you know, the procedure of the 14-day quarantine in those days was on day 8, they gave you a kit and you had to swab with a live Zoom call with a nurse. And so all 5 of us, or like there's 5, they didn't actually have to do my youngest because she was only 5 years old, but she'd already been PCR tested leaving the Philippines as negative. But the other 4 of us all had to swab at the same time on the same file, and they were emailed the same results, and they were all couriered because we live on a farm. They were couriered remotely, and they got there. And then all of a sudden on day, I think it was it was about day 13 or 14, they called and demanded to talk to my wife, and we put it on speaker. So I was listening, and they said, "You can't leave the quarantine because we didn't receive your swab results." And we explained to them that they all went in the same courier package.
Yeah.
And then they threatened that the police were going to come. They knew where we lived. They were going to come to our house if she broke quarantine protocol. But I was allowed to break quarantine protocol because they had my negative results and my kids could. And they eventually on day 18, we received 3 more swab tests. But we never filled them out. We just kept them as a souvenir. So it was quite an experience. And then at that point, we still had these $7,000 in fines, and I didn't know what to do, but I knew I wasn't going to be coerced into paying it. And at that point, there was members of my family that were threatening me that I was foolish because I didn't just go into a quarantine hotel, and they don't even talk to me anymore. And then I had other members of my family, who were completely supportive, understanding that this is pretty draconian. And we got, luckily, we got contacted through you guys. We reached out and we saw Fight the Fines and the Democracy Fund. And you guys said, "Don't worry, we'll help you." And you have. So the sum up this long story, over many court appearances by our lawyers on behalf of us, because we had to appear in Vancouver, even though we lived in just north of Saskatchewan. Right. There was no option to appear here. They threatened that we were going to lose if we didn't appear in person, but our lawyers were very good and presented our cases. They then gave us the good news that because the fines were very high and they were the same for me and my wife, that if we pled guilty to one of them, that they would drop the other one. And we refused that again as well. And then over a year later, we just finally got news that our charges were stayed, and there was no explanation to any of all of this taxpayer dollar that went to scare and coerce us. By the way, this was the final straw with how we live. We decided, because of all of this and everything else that's going on in Canada, we've permanently taken our kids and our family, and we've this March we've moved to the Philippines permanent. So I don't know when we're going back. We followed all of the protocols and all of the things here, and Philippines is even more strict than it was in Canada. Like, they still mask, but they're reasonable here, right? They didn't threaten to take my children away because I wanted to do it a bit different. But we're doing what we can. I just was really shocked that my country, which I used to brag about, that we could travel freely when we landed in our country, and that was the one thing I was proud of. My parents blessed us with trips all over the world. In my life, I've been to the Soviet Union in 1986 when it was communist. I was 15 years old and I got to experience that. I've lived in Israel, I've lived in England, I've lived all over the world, New Zealand, Australia. What's happening now is very, very disheartening for my children's future. So I wanted to go where they could have the most freedom possible to grow up, and that's why we decided to come here right now. Hopefully, we can return to Canada one day when things get a little bit more clear.
Well, I think it's terrible that our government has chased away a good family of hardworking Canadians. But on the flip side, I'm very proud that so many people were willing to donate to the Democracy Fund to help a total stranger. That's the amazing thing about the Democracy Fund, is there are all these Canadians out there who are largely unaffected by pandemic lockdown fines, but they know other families are. And so they donated to make sure that they had the legal support. So while the government is terrible, I remain heartened that Canadians are good people.
I agree. And the people we've never had a problem with that. The Democracy Fund and what Fight the Fines did for us, we were going to fight this ourselves, and it would have taken all of the savings that we've used. We're not very wealthy people to do all this, right? I was overwhelmed by the support and help we got, and even with what's happened since then, when people who donate to help out a cause like this and have their bank accounts frozen for no legal reason, it makes me extra grateful that people were willing to take that risk and stick with us.
People seem to forget that even though the skies are opened up and people can fly again, people are still being persecuted and dragged through the court system and threatened for things that were illegal for like a moment in time that are no longer illegal now. Life has gone back to normal, except if you have this thing looming over your head. And I think it's outrageous, and there should be amnesty for people like you.
That's the part that blows my mind, that the people who I know are against this are too scared for convenience to object.
I'm so proud of our Rebel News viewers. You guys care so deeply about civil liberties and freedoms that you will give your hard-earned money to help a stranger you've never met and make a difference in the lives of people you've never met in ways you can't even fathom. Now, I'm grateful I get to talk to these people, and sometimes they thank me, but the thanks is not mine at all. It belongs to you at home. So let me thank you at home for what you do for families like Kevin's. But there are more families like his out there being helped through the Democracy Fund because the court system and politicians refuse to back off these COVID fines. If you'd like to help them, please consider making a donation to fightthefines.com. And thanks again. I know it means a lot to Kevin, and it definitely means a lot to me. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. The restrictions are largely over, but the COVID prosecutions, or rather persecutions, depending on how you look at it, they continue. So plenty of families out there still need our help fighting their lockdown tickets and quarantine tickets in court. If you'd like to make a donation to help in their legal battle, please visit fightthefines.com. All donations there qualify for a charitable tax receipt through a partnership with the registered Canadian charity, the Democracy Fund.